Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hi, I am Irma. I'm from Group 1. And on this occasion, me and my team, Ahmad Taufik Mubarak, Gita Duyani, Intan Oktaviani, and Maya Khairatun Julaika, will present the understanding whiteness in the United States. First is the article identity. This article is written by Judith and Martin with the theme social cultures and the title Understanding Whiteness in the United States. And then background of this article. What does it mean to be a white person in the United States? We all know that in the United States there are various people with different ethnicities, different race, different cultures, and different skin colors. But today, on this occasion, we will only discussing about whiteness in the United States. This article attempts to sort out some of the issues about whiteness, racial and ethnic identity, and explore the contradiction and tension in the notion of whiteness as an identity. This article also discusses about how being white in the United States and how it may influence the communication in the social context. Next is a communication perspective on identity. We all know that we have multiple identities such as gender, religious, ethnicity, race, and etc. And all of that make up our self-concept and how we see ourselves. And identities arise from our associations with groups, some voluntary or something that we get, or our beliefs such as professional and religious affiliation, and some is involuntary or naturally attached to us, such as age and family groups. And all of that then develop through communication with others. Identities are dynamic and context related. What does it mean? For example, there is someone and she is a female. She is a professor and she is white German American. And all of those are her identities. And all of those identities may be highlighted or suppressed depending on the situation and or the context where she in. For example, when she is in some situation, such as when she is the only white person in conversation and they are talking about race, so people might see her talking about race as a white person. But in another context, when she is talking about race in a class with her students, people might think that she is talking as a professor because her professor identity may be emphasized more in a class. White racial and ethnic identity. Race versus ethnicity. Many people believe that race has to do with physical characteristics, whereas ethnicity is more a sense of a shared culture, belief system, and origin. But there are some arguments that reject the biological arguments in favor of a more social approach to understanding race. That is, while there may be some physiological basis for racial categories, it is the way in which these categories are constructed and the meaning attached to racial categories that have a profound influence on communication and how identities are negotiated. First is racial categories vary widely in different parts of the world. One contrast is seen in the United States and South America. In the United States, there are two major racial distinctions, black and white. And this distinction is fairly rigid. So what about someone of mixed racial origin. For example, when she was born from a black dad and then a white mom, how we can categorize him or her. And then next is racial categories have changed throughout immigration history, and some groups have been shifted from one racial category to another at particular points in history. In the 18th century, British immigrants struggled to preserve their base of power and even to prevent other Europeans from entering the United States. Then, in the 19th century, as more and more Southern Europeans immigrated, there was an attempt to classify Irish and Jewish Europeans as non-white. Instead, the racial line was drawn around Europe, and those outside, such as the Chinese and Japanese, were then designated as non-white. So while the notion of race has some basis in physiology, it probably makes more sense to talk about race formation and to think about race as a complex of social meanings that get interpreted through communication rather than as something fixed, concrete, and objective. It should also be pointed out that as socially constructed, these categories are relational, exist in relation to each other.
Hello, I'm Maya Harodun. I will continue from Irma presentation. I will convey about bounded versus dominant or normative identities. The relationship between white racial and ethnic identity can be clarified by distinguishing between bounded and dominant identities. Bounded cultures are those groups we belong to that are specific and not dominant or normative, such as groups defined by religion, gender, or ethnicity. For example, being Irish American means we celebrate St. Patrick's Day, and being Amish means we follow the Arnhem or the community rules. However, the dominant or normative white culture is a much more slippery construct. That's more difficult to define but just as real. It is not often easy to see what cultural practices or norms link white people together. For example, we usually don't think of Thanksgiving as a white American holiday. Part of the slipperiness of this identity is related to the dominant or normative aspect of being white. The next point, identity and power. Sometimes the more powerful aspects of identity are the most unrecognized, and power is more strongly linked to aspects of identity that are ascribed or involuntary. For example, when questioned about identity, male will often not mention gender, they just don't think about it, whereas women are more likely to be aware of how gender is a part of their identity. The same thing may be true about being white. One reason white people don't think about being white is that they may not need to. Tom Nakayama and Robert Kruzik in 1995 suggest that this lack of consciousness on the part of white is possible only because of the power associated with being white. The experiences and communication pattern of whites are taken as a norm from which other are marked or measured. The universal norm then becomes invisible. For example, the news media refer to black leaders but never to white leaders, and there is black on black violence, but European conflicts are not referred to as white on white violence. In the other hand, Nakayama has written about growing up in the South as a fourth generation Japanese American. As a Japanese descendant with an American identity, Nakayama concluded that there were two rhetorics he encountered. Firstly, Nakayama and Kruzek attempt to show how the invisibility of whiteness is related to power by analyzing the rhetoric of whiteness, or how white people talk about being white when explicitly asked. They discuss and conclude that white is not a category of identity, but Black African American of Chicanese. And secondly, a second rhetorical strategy was to say that being white was based on negation, that white is not something else, not black, brown, yellow, or red. This seems like a natural way to talk about being white, but they point out that in this strategy, white is again the universal against which other colors are marked. And the last point, Edith Falk argues that there is relative continuum of power in the United States associated with various identity, ranging from the more powerful group such as whites, males, Protestants, heterosexual, middle or upper classes, and the educated, and the less powerful group such as racial minorities, females, religions other than Protestants, gays, the working class, and the less educated. Those are more involuntary or physically are more difficult and the most problematic to negotiate. For example, growing up as an Amish or Mennonite young woman, I feel marginalized in many social contexts because I was physically marked by a distinctive dress and physical appearance. It was difficult to negotiate with anything other than a bounded or Amish identity. What are the communicative consequences when identities are challenged? When, for example, Asian American asks, "Where are you really from?" or "Do you speak in English?" How does it affect the communication between people when the identities of some are often challenged and other whites are rarely challenged?
Okay, the next one is about dimensions of what identity is, whether there is a set of cultural norms and symbols shared by most white people. Yeah, this is an interesting question. Many scholars feel that there are uniquely white cultural patterns, but that they are often difficult to discern. Sociologists, namely Ruth Frankenberg, suggests that one way to understand whiteness is to view it not as simply a racial or ethnic category, but rather as a set of three linked dimensions in which power is a key ingredient. So, let's begin with the first dimension of white identity. Whiteness is a location of structural privilege. All whites do not have power and do not have equal access to power. Uh, how this is happened? In the journal says that whites rarely talk about issues of power when discussing interethnic communication, whereas it is a more central issue in African American frameworks. So, this one aspect of being white that fact I don't consider power issues in conversation. Perhaps you can think of other ways that privilege may be reflected in white communication. Then, while being white in the United States may mean privilege sometimes, there seems to be an increasing perception that being white doesn't mean invisible privilege. Uh, researcher Charles Gallagher, who interviewed college students in a large inner city campus, found that white students thought a lot being white and saw their whiteness not as a privilege but as a liability. They often felt that minority students were getting more breaks and more privileges. They also They also felt that they were prejudged by students of color as being racist because they were white. So in the United States, uh, a white American uh, suddenly judged because of having the skin color white. They 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 judge as a racist. Then the growing awareness of a white identity is occurring because the changing demographics in the United States means that whites are beginning to perceive themselves in the minority. Then Gallagher not only studied about invisible privilege, but also asked students to estimate the ratio of whites to blacks on campus. Many students reported that they thought the ratio was 30% of white students, 70% black students. In fact, the actual ratio was 70% white and 30% black. The point here is not inaccuracy of the perception of whether whites or minorities are more privileged, but how this perception affect intercultural communication. How do we communicate with others if we feel that we are being prejudged as racist or as privileged? The next is the second dimension of white identity. Whiteness is a standpoint. A second dimension of white identity, according to Frankenberg, is a standpoint, a place from which white people look at themselves and others and at society. So, if we are looking today in the American know, known as the racist country, because there are so many examples why this country called like that. A dramatic example arose during the trial of African American celebrity. For example, in the 1995, namely O.J. Simpson, accused of killing his ex-wife, namely Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend Ron Goldman. An ABC News poll conducted just before the verdict was handed down showed a profound split between white and black perception. This is the most important one. There are really different standpoints that happen in this case. 77% of whites thought Simpson was guilty. Meanwhile, 72% of blacks believed he was innocent. This case was happened in October 1995. Both whites and blacks saw the same televised trial, the same evidence, heard the same legal arguments, but saw those from two different standpoints and arrived at two different conclusions. How could this be? Experts analyzed the two standpoints and tried to understand this dramatic difference in perception in the days immediately following the trial. Let me give you more examples about the difference of a standpoint in the United States. A CBS News poll reported in the Arizona Republic that asked about race relation. 38% of whites versus 70% of blacks think that race relations in the United States are generally good. So something about being white influences how we view the world and ultimately how we communicate with others. As one individual reported in Nakayama and Krisek's study, I don't know exactly what it means to be white, but we all know that. I mean, I never thought about it, but I know that we understand each other at some level, at some point. Like when a black guy gets on an elevator, or when you have a choice to sit or stand next to a white person, a black person. You pick the white person and you look at each other, the whites, and you just know that you have got it better. You don't say anything, but you know it is in the looks. Of course, all white perceive all situations in the same way. Remember that identity is dynamic, negotiated, and context dependent. Perhaps it is easier to see shared perception in dramatic situations, to see uh, like the Simpson trial or the Rodney King beating and the subsequent trial of white police officers. And even then, it is still difficult to understand how perceptions are related to race. But I suggest to you to do not be racist. We are all humans beings. We are a gift of the God. We have to understand each other. Do not underestimate each other. So for the next topic will be presented by my friend Intan. Time is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Intan Octaviani. Whiteness is a set of core symbols, norms, and labels. Core symbols are those values and priorities of a cultural groups that are reflected in the norm of behavior and labels used to describe the group. Often the norms are unmarked. They are not made explicit, and it is hard to identify what norms are uniquely shared by whites. As not, this difficulty comes partly from the normative and dominant aspect of being white. The dilemma is that white is everything and it is nothing. It is just there, and yet it is difficult to talk about, maybe even embracing. Sometimes these cultural practices are most clearly visible to those who are not white, to those groups who are excluded. Janet Helms and others have attempted to outline values that are shared primarily by white people. For example, they suggest that a strong belief in individualism and an emphasis on linear thinking are two patterns that are most strongly linked to being white and aren't universally shared by other cultural groups in the United States. The label we attach to ourselves and others, that characteristic ethnicity and or race may be seen a category of core symbol and are another way in which identity is expressed. Labels have meaning and are neutral. The question of label and identity have been of concern to marginalized groups for a long time. One issue revolves around who has the right to name others, who has the right to use a labels. Again, power comes into play, for dominant groups can exercise power in naming others, and it is often difficult for the less powerful groups to control their own labels. Dolores Tano described how her multiple identities are reflected in various labels: Spanish, Mexican, American, Latina, and Chinana. The Spanish label is one she was given by her family and designed as Creole origin or Spain. The label Mexican American reflects two important cultures that make up her identity. Latina reflects cultural and historical connectedness with other of Spanish descent, such as Puerto Ricans and South Americans, and the Chicana labels promote political and cultural assertiveness in representing her identity. She stressed that she is all this, that each reveals a different phase of her identity: symbolic, historical, cultural, and political. Similarly, the labels and meaning for African American have evolved over years. Head, Collier, and Rebu claim that the shift from Black of African American is a self-preferred label is founded in issues of self-determination, strength, program, and control. White identity development. How to develop a sense of whiteness? This sense, just like our sense of gender, develop over time and through communication with others. There seems to be several stages of identity development, not with the definite beginning and end, but stage nonetheless they represent different positions of understanding who we are. In the United States, minority groups members develop a sense of racial and ethnic identity much earlier than majority groups members do. As physiologist Rita Hadiman described, that is a 5-stage. The next presentation will be presented by Dwi Febriani.
Stage 1. The social consciousness. In Hardiman's model, the first stage of identity development is the same for white and minority groups. In this stage, children may be aware of physical differences and some cultural differences, but do not feel fearful or hostile and do not feel racially superior. Eventually, they absorb the message from the social environment or family and society, but racial group. Stage 2. Acceptance. The second stage, acceptance, represents the internalization of the message about racial group membership and the acquisition of a belief in the normalcy or superiority of being white. This may be either a passive acceptance or an active acceptance of the dominant socialization. An important point here is that individuals at this stage are not aware that they have been programmed to accept a particular worldview about race. Passive acceptance. In the passive acceptance stage, there is no conscious identification with being white. White at this stage might hold the following subtly racist views but do not see themselves as being racist. Rather, racism is seen as the holding of extreme attitudes, such as those espoused by the Ku Klux Klan. Passive acceptance stage, such as 1. Minority groups are culturally deprived and need help to assimilate. 2. Affirmative action is reverse discrimination because people of color are being given opportunities that whites have never had. 3. White culture, music, art, and literature is classical. Works of art by people of color are primitive art or craft. 4. People of color are culturally different, whereas white are individuals with no group identity, cultures, or shared experience of racial privilege. Active acceptance. Those white in the active acceptance stage are very conscious of their whiteness and may express their feeling of superiority collectively or as with a white student union. There may be open resentment towards minorities who are perceived to be more advantaged. Why do all the black students sit together in the student union? Stage 3 resistance. The resistance stage represents a major attitudinal shift from a position that blames victims for their condition to one that names and blames a white-owned dominant group as the source of racial problems. This resistance might take the form of passive resistance with little behavioral change of or active resistance and ownership of racism. In the active resistance stage, whites believe that changing the white community is the responsibility of whites. They shift from being a good liberal helper to being an active agent of change. Stage for redefinition. In this stage, energy is refocused or redirected to redefining whiteness in non-racist terms. White comes to see that they not have to accept the definition of white that is placed on them by society. Sometimes this can be done only by coming into contact with the interaction with people of color before moving on to redefine one's own white identity. Racism is harmful to white and to move beyond thinking that racism affects only people of color. Stage 5. Internalization. In this stage, whites are finally able to integrate their whiteness into all other facets of their identity, and this affects other aspects of social and personal identity, like sexual, religious role, and so on. At this point, there is less consciousness about identity. All aspects are internalized and manifested in spontaneous behavior.
Yeah, guys, I think that's all. Thank you for being kind listeners. I hope you can understand clearly. And if you have any question, whatever you want to ask to our group, you can drop out your question in the WhatsApp group or in the Google Classroom here, and we will answer it quickly. So, the last I say, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bye.